مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. كشف الرئيس الصيني عن نيته في توجيه السياسة الخارجية لأكبر دولة في العالم من حيث عدد السكان والقوى العسكرية العظمى الصاعدة بعيدا عن المصالحة مع الغرب، حيث حذر من التطورات الدولية الخطرة التي لم نشهدها في 100 عام الماضية. وفي خطاب استمر قرابة الساعتين في افتتاح المؤتمر الوطني العشرين للحزب الشيوعي الصيني في بكين يوم الأحد، أشاد جينبينغ بنجاح إدارته في مواجهة ما سماه التدخل الأجنبي وحماية كرامة الصين. حول اتجاه سياسات ولاية الرئيس الصيني الثالثة واحتمالية الصدام مع الغرب، ينضم إلينا الدكتور هايتون، زميل برنامج آسيا والمحيط الهادئ في معهد تشاتام هاوس. دكتور بيل، مرحبا بك معنا.
Thank you for having me.
إلى أين تتجه الصين باعتقادك بناء على ما أعلنه الرئيس الصيني في افتتاح المؤتمر الوطني العشرين للحزب الشيوعي الصيني في بكين من خطط وآمال للبلاد؟
I think China is heading inwards, despite all its talk of globalization. I think the leadership is very worried about the international environment. It's worried about instability at home. And I think it's trying to close off its population from outside influences as much as it can. Not completely, but I think it also wants to try to reduce the possibilities of economic pressure on China, maybe taking some lessons from the way that Russia has been put under pressure after the invasion of Ukraine.
في هذا السياق، ما هي أهم الرسائل التي وجهها شي جينبينغ في خطابه للغرب؟
Well, I think what he's saying, he's addressing his own people more than the West, but there are clearly messages there for outsiders. And what he's trying to say, I think, is that China has the ability to decide its own future and is taking steps to avoid coming under pressure. At the same time, he's appearing very confident. He's saying, that China suppressed COVID and was able to sustain economic growth during that period, that it's continuing to improve the standard of living for its people. But at the same time, you get this sense that it's worried about the international environment. The last 4 congresses, the leader has talked about living in a period of strategic opportunity. Now, Xi Jinping didn't mention that phrase this time, which suggests that maybe the Chinese leadership doesn't see the current situation as an opportunity, but more as a threat.
خلال الخطاب بدأ أن الرئيس الصيني مصر على أن الأمن يأتي أولاً، وأن الحزب وحده هو الذي يمكنه الحفاظ على أمن الشعب الصيني. هل الصين مصممة على إجبار الدول الأخرى على قبول سلوكها وطموحاتها بدل تهدئة مخاوفهم؟
It's an interesting problem, I think. And I think this is to do with the sort of the inwards-looking nature of the leadership. They really don't have that much experience of the outside world. Their primary audience is domestic, for the people at home. And the foreign ministry, for example, is a very junior ministry in the Chinese system, much less important than the domestic ministries and parts of the system. So I don't really think they understand quite why some of their actions have such a negative reception overseas, particularly in Western countries. The image of China in European and North American countries has really gone downhill in the 10 years that President Xi has been in charge. Although having said that, it's gone up in other parts of the world, maybe in Africa, where Chinese businesses have been more active. But I think that when China does something which it thinks is in its own interests, for example, building up its navy or whatever, it doesn't take into account the feelings of other countries and the worries that other countries have. And so those other countries, in Southeast Asia or other places, are reaching out to America and Japan and Europe, for extra reassurance, because they're worried about China's intentions.
بناء على هذه المعطيات، كيف يمكن وصف علاقة الصين والغرب في المرحلة الحالية؟
Well, I think the Western countries, Europe and the North America, are increasingly concerned about China. There was a long time when there was a view that China could be their partner in the international system, that China was a big engine for economic growth and globalization and prosperity. But I think some of the things that China's been doing recently, in the treatment of Muslim minorities in Xinjiang or the crackdown in Hong Kong. But also, I think its behavior during the COVID pandemic, where it clearly prioritized its own needs, and lots of European countries that were relying on China to provide it with protection equipment against the virus, and they were left without anything because China diverted those supplies. And things like that have really changed the opinion of certainly of European countries. The EU for a long time tried to kind of balance its views of seeing China as many things, a partner in some things and a competitor in others and a systemic risk in other areas of life. But increasingly, I think it's moving more and more towards the risk end of the spectrum. And in the UK, it's likely that the latest version of the security review, which is a cross-government thing, is going to reclassify China from being a risk to being a threat. And I think that's indicative of the way a lot of Western governments have changed their views on China.
في هذا السياق ماذا عن ردود الغرب تجاه تطلعات الصين؟ مثلا كتبت الفاينانشال تايمز أنه استجابة للمخاوف من النفوذ العسكري والاقتصادي المتزايد للصين تعمل الولايات المتحدة وحلفائها على إضفاء الطابع الرسمي على مجموعات اقتصادية وأمنية متعددة الأطراف تقيد وصول الصين إلى التقنيات الرائدة.
Well, I think there's lots of things going on there. I think the US is worried about losing its preeminent position in technology, partly for commercial reasons, but also I think there's a recognition that some of these technologies are really going to change the security of the world. The ability, to use artificial intelligence or quantum physics or certain other kinds of technologies. They're really going to change not just the economy, but also the security of the world. And so I think the US has really now taken an absolute decision to try and block China's progress in these areas. Now, the Europeans are kind of stuck in the middle a bit, but because they are in many ways dependent on the US for lots of their technology, it's likely that they'll have to fall in line with what the Americans want, simply because of the sort of the commercial relations between them. Whereas I think a lot of European businesses might be prepared to sort of try and stay in the middle between the US and China. I think increasingly we're going to see them having to choose, and they will choose the US side, even if that means, I think, a slowdown or bad news for the world economy, in the sense that sort of globalization, which has allowed massive economic growth for so many years, is really kind of slowing down at the moment.
بحديثك عن هذه العلاقة المرتبكة مع الولايات المتحدة وفي إطار المنافسة بينهما، هل ستستمر الضغوط على الدول التي تختار التعامل مع الصين في بعض التقنيات والمجالات؟
I think they will be, yes, they will face more pressure to choose a side or the other. But I think any country in the middle will try to maximize the benefits from both sides and try to avoid choosing if it can. Clearly, China wants to invest and trade a lot, and there will be benefits for the countries in accepting investment and trade. But they will need to be worried about whether any strings or conditions attached to such deals. And they'll also have to sort of think about, whether doing a deal is genuinely what the Chinese call win-win for both sides, or whether it just opens the doors for a lot of imports from China and doesn't really do much to promote the exports of their own country. China is obviously very hungry for energy in general. And of course, that's been a big part of the Middle East trade with China for oil and natural gas. But also, China is looking to export its own manufactured products and things. So there will be, certainly reasons for Middle Eastern countries to continue to, have close economic and political relations with China. But I think there's going to be increasing pressure from the US, maybe from some of the European countries as well, to be very careful about not getting trapped in that relationship with China.
طيب، عندما نتحدث عن الضغوط، هل يمكن أن تتطور هذه الضغوط وتتحول إلى عقوبات بالنسبة للدول التي انخرطت في شراكات كبيرة مع الصين، مثلا باكستان؟
I think in general, countries won't be sanctioned merely for trading with China, but for example, we were talking a moment ago about these new restrictions on certain technology exports. And if these countries find themselves, breaching those new rules, then yes, of course, there's a risk of being sanctioned. But I think that's probably unlikely. They're unlikely to be receiving that kind of high-tech material from the US anyway. But I don't know. I think there will be so many countries seeking to balance their relations between the US and Europe on the one hand and China on the other side that I don't think any pressure on any particular country to reject Chinese ties is going to work. China's offer is going to be very attractive, for the foreseeable future. So I don't think the US will even try to stop countries trading with China.
سؤالي الأخير سيكون عن الوضع الداخلي في الصين. طبعا داخليا في الوقت الذي يشرع فيه الرئيس ولايته الثالثة، هل سيؤدي ذلك إلى علو أصوات من يخشون معارضته واختفاء أصوات المعارضين؟
I think what we're seeing in China really is the consolidation of Xi Jinping's control in the Communist Party and more generally in society. He doesn't seem to have any serious opposition within the party to his rule. He may have to make a few concessions to sort of bring different sort of groups more, into the centers of power or whatever. But I don't see any sign of anything that could be called opposition to him. We're seeing signs that the man who's been his deputy, in effect, Li Keqiang, will retire, and that a new premier will be installed, and that generally they have responsibility for the more economic side of policy. But Xi Jinping has taken control even of much of the economic side of it, leaving very little for Li Keqiang to do. We did see just before the Congress a very isolated protest on a bridge in Beijing, but I think this was so rare that it attracted attention just because it is so unusual. In general, the party is very much in control. The Communist Party is very much in control of politics and developments in China, and Xi Jinping and his circle appear to be very much in control of the party.
دكتور هايتون، شكرا للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
My pleasure.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.